What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the, I'm going to call it the Weekend Review pod that I'm now trying to do every Friday afternoon, 1 p.m., settling into the weekend here, a rainy weekend here in the DMV, the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area of which I reside. So, we'll be surviving though. Not a ton going on NFL news wise, but we make our own news here on this podcast. Earlier this week, if you didn't have a chance to listen to it, I spoke to resident computer cowboy slash Hal bot, however you want to classify him, Ben Baldwin. And we went through our front office rankings, focusing specifically on top five, bottom five, discussing some other interesting ones in between. As you might suspect, you guys are going to be shocked when you hear this. Not everyone agreed. Yeah, I know. It's a weird one out there. Not everyone agreed, and some people would prefer front office rankings where you bring in all of the win-loss records from last season, make some adjustments for the playoffs, teams that won and maybe went a little bit further in the playoffs than their win-loss record would have identified. Maybe do the same exercise for last season. Go ahead, sort those together, come up with an average sort of number with more of a weighting on last year. And that would be their front office rankings. Maybe we'll go back a bit further when it comes to some teams like the 49ers. And I'll talk about a lot about that. So we'll talk about the reactions to that. Nothing is surprising. But I knew when I sent out our list of top and bottom five, it would get a reaction. I didn't realize it would get as big of a reaction. But at this point, you have to walk the fine line of, number one, you want to be noticed when you're doing this type of content, right? Like, no one wants to be doing it in a vacuum where you're just talking to yourself. You don't establish a Twitter presence, do a YouTube video, start a Substack, do all that sort of stuff just for a mental exercise. You want to be noticed. And sometimes being noticed by the right people means you have to be also noticed and critiqued and yelled at by the wrong people in a ratio of about 1 to 10. More like 1 to 50 when it comes to these things. And that's something you have to deal with. Now, what you don't want to do, and this is something I can't remember who I heard this from initially, but I think this is very important. Something I try to keep in mind is you don't want to be affected by the criticism so much and be affected by the reactions, the outsized reactions, and be hunting for that sort of thing and want to embody and start to become more and more focused on being the person having the ideas that your critics hate, kind of living that part of that caricature that critics hate. That's what you want to stay away from. Not the easiest thing to do for a lot of people. Everyone errs in that direction sometimes, I think, because it's fun to say, I made some joke about the fact that someone was calling us bozos. And I was like, well, if we're getting called bozos by Lions fan 53875, then maybe that's okay. Whether Ben or I were the bigger was the biggest bozo. So I like to have fun with those sort of things, but you want to be affected by good criticism and try to be relatively unaffected by bad criticism. And Ben Baldwin, I don't know if it's a response to this exercise. I think it probably was a response to this exercise, as he said his filter for who to engage with is whether they can properly restate, or at least state, I should say. Actually, I guess restate works. Your argument, right? So if someone can't figure out can't even say what your argument is, then they probably don't deserve to be engaged with. And I think that's just shorthand for, if someone's not going to engage with your argument at all, if they're going to reflexively dismiss it, then you're not really obligated to engage back with them, because what are we going, this is not a symmetrical sort of exercise. Normally what ends up happening is you have to engage with them just to be like, hey, did you actually listen to what I said? Let me tell you, this is what I actually said. And then maybe from that, you can go back and forth and get something, but it can be a fool's errand a lot of the time. So we're going to talk about that. I want to talk about quarterback perceptions. There was another pod that enraged people out there somewhat from the Athletic football show, football program. I don't know what it's called. NFL pod, where Robert Mays and crew, Nate Tice is gone, so we had some other people there, discussed they've done this for at least a few years now, where they have a quarterback draft where they take contracts into account, which I'll talk about. That has become relatively a smaller part of the exercise, which I think is correct. They take contracts into account and they say, let's draft quarterbacks that we'd want over the next 3 years, I believe. They may have been 4 years in the past, but it's 3 years here. And then went through that exercise. Some of the rankings made some people upset. I'll talk about whether I agree or disagree, how I would go about the exercise. I'll share with you numbers that I updated my Bayesian quarterback projections in those numbers, and I think they look pretty good. For this will be kind of what I'm looking at going into next season. So we'll talk that. Eric Eager, the good doctor, Dr. Eager, is now going to be working for the Carolina Panthers. I'll discuss that. That'll be fun. And a few other things. Again, I'm taking questions here in the YouTube comments. If anyone wants to leave something there, I'll take Q&A there. I have paid subscriber questions that have come in via the Substack. And then maybe there might be a question or two on Twitter that I might address, although I think it's really going to fall into play. But what I realize is the stuff that I was going to talk about, it's all part of the questions that were asked. So I'm just going to go, rather than redo it, rather than talk about a subject about quarterback rankings and then go back to a question about how I feel about Trevor Lawrence or something like that, why not just go to the questions? And then I'll be restating myself somewhat when questions go over similar topics, but go to the questions and then wrap that into more of a comprehensive thing about the topics that I want to talk about during this broadcast. Okay. All right. Let's start with, there's got to start with the paid subscribers, especially my man Sam here, Samuel, who is a founding member. Get on his level, people. Get on Sam's level, or Samuel, I should say here. I don't want to, if you go by Samuel, not Sam, I want to make sure I get that right. So we're going to go where I can be bought and paid for in this regard. And this is with these questions here. Okay. So the first question that we have here is, it says, I was wondering if you could summarize your top and bottom teams and maybe explain your methodology or numbers you used a little bit more. Now, of course, we're talking about the front office rankings here. But that's me. That's my commentary adding in. It was a little hard to follow takeaways in the podcast. Discussion was great. It's a very difficult topic, but at least trying to set up some parameters is interesting and can lead to some good fundamental ideas. I agree. I think that's the most important part. Now, we were thrown a little bit of a curveball. I was thrown a little bit of a curveball by Ben when we were doing this exercise, in that he was getting pinged by the fact that he had to go pick up his kid because they're sick. This crazy breeder over there has 3 kids. I mean, that's like insanity in today's day and age. What is he like? Is he a billionaire or something? What's going on over there for Ben Baldwin? So he's got 3 kids, voluntarily entering back into having a baby over the course of the last couple of years. So, congrats to him. He's what I call being in the shit still. That's figurative in the sense of like Vietnam, and literal when it comes to having a baby. So he had to go early, and I knew we had a window. So I knew I was just going to, try to be respectful of that, but at the same time, try to get some content going here too. And I was going to push him until he basically had to leave. So I think we got like 45 minutes, 50 minutes out of him. So I kind of rushed it a little bit there because it was a little bit over ambitious of an exercise, because we had the top 5 and the bottom 5 at the end, which we were going to discuss. We're going to have some differences there. So that's quite a few teams to discuss. We had a number of teams that didn't fall into either, which I thought warranted discussion. And then we had like the setup of the methodology and things like that. And this is what Samuel's talking about here, is the methodology. And I do agree that I think that's one of the most important pieces. Unfortunately, it wasn't something that I could go into in great detail. That's the part that got trimmed, I would say, a bit, is how we want to set everything up. So I'm going to go through my methodology on this, and it's going to be a little potentially confusing for some people. I'm going to try to make it as little confusion as possible going into this. But it's just going to talk about where we are as far as what actually matters for rankings versus what may be standing out in people's minds. And this goes beyond like wins and losses. Okay, but this is not even part of the wins and losses discussion of good teams. Even people who have I believe are thoughtful when they're looking at front offices may differ quite a bit from what I had rankings, in particular in the Jaguars. The Jaguars were a big one that came up as people disagreeing. People like Arif Hassan and some others who I think are very thoughtful guys, do amazing, great, fantastic analytical work. We're like, huh? Jaguars, like I'm not buying that. So this will go into some of the explanation here. So when I crafted a little bit of a spreadsheet just to get my thoughts in order a bit, where I had the rankings from the draft this last season as to how much surplus value they added. As part of that, I had the rankings from the 2023 draft. I had a little bit of adjustment where I knock teams down if they're getting like a big quarterback premium in one of those drafts, because you get a huge positional value for drafting a quarterback. But, not everyone needs a quarterback. Not everyone is in position to get a quarterback. So we don't want to give them two. So I have like a number that I'm adding there to kind of raise their ranking. They're raising, meaning making it a higher number, meaning not being near the top there for their ranking. So penalizing them basically if a team had drafted a quarterback, especially high over the last 2 years. And then I have some like off-season moves that I added a little bit of stuff in, but it's not comprehensive. And probably I could have been worse with the Jaguars when it came to some of the stuff that they've done in the offseason than I did on here, which would have lowered them further. But from a pure, and again, I'm really focusing on the last 2 years for this. And I know that could be a problem for people too. Again, when it comes to the Jaguars and the objections there, for them, a lot of people are saying, hey, they drafted Travis Etienne, and that was a number of years ago. The Trayvon Walker pick, a bunch of other things that happened. I think those are, we'll talk about those things, the Etienne pick and others. I'm focusing less on that stuff that happened, like in the Urban Meyer sort of era. But it's a way, I think the Jaguars are a good way to get a window into what my process is, because we have the positional value component. We have the trade value component, and then we have the reach adjustment. So, like when it comes to someone like Arif Hassan, and we're having a discussion about the Jaguars, he's probably very focused on this reach component, reach/value component. I know he's aware of the research, which shows that reaching is worse than steals. I know he had like a synopsis of the draft, this last draft, based upon his consensus big board. He was an innovator in that regard, having that metric out there for everyone to see. So he probably looks at something like, oh, you took Walker instead of Aiden Hutchinson. That's a big reach by the consensus big board, and that's a very, very overwhelming factor for the Jaguars. Now, I do have the Jaguars reaching this last year. I do in this last draft. I have them reaching the draft before, but overall, they still look pretty good. And why is that? Well, positional value, again, not great, slightly negative. So that's something too, where Arif was saying, hey, they haven't been great at positional value either. It took Tank Bigsby last year in the third round as a running back, things like that. Yeah, I agree. They have been great. But the big difference, and this is going to be like the biggest mover for me as a relative difference too, because a lot of teams don't even make many trades or make very few minor trades. The biggest relative advantage or disadvantage a team can have is in the trade market when it comes to the draft. And this is almost completely ignored, right? When people are talking about the Jags to me, and again, I had them as fifth best. So, fifth best is closer to 15th best than it is to first, just if you look at kind of like a normal distribution for how outcomes work, right? In quality. So when you look at them, their total trade value that they earned, $22 million on this last draft. It was just really one trade back in the first round, which makes a big difference. So $22 million in this draft. They made 3 or 4 trade backs last year and made about another 20 something million. So they have about 45 million in surplus value that they earned off of trading back in the last 2 drafts. I mean, that is massive. Okay. Again, most people are focusing on these reach numbers, which are anywhere from, positive on the outliers are like positive 7 to negative 7 million for one draft. Most of them are between, 1 and 3 million for a draft. A lot of people are focused on positional value, which can be pretty huge for quarterbacks. But outside of quarterback, we're talking about, 10 to 15 million are the big moves. Big moves for positional value. Yet with trade value, 45 million that the Jaguars are making, and that's completely erased from memories when it comes to evaluating how a front office is doing things. Now, it's not a difficult thing to do. Procedurally, it's not a difficult thing to do. Um, you let it be known you're willing to trade back, or a team calls you and they want to trade up, and you accept the best offer. Not the most difficult thing procedurally to do. Now, intellectually, and it can be a very difficult thing to do. Obviously, it's a very difficult thing to do. But what we know about trade backs is, number one, it's a big raw number that we have as far as the value, which is, again, it's mostly ignored. So we're getting a huge relative advantage to the crowd if we pay attention to these things. And number two is we can measure it better than these other things. We can measure it a lot better. Who's a good free agent signing versus who's not a good free agent signing? Tough to measure. Tough to measure for individuals. If you look by position, again, who's a good draft pick, who's not a good draft pick? Tough to measure just by individuals, right? You could say, oh, Aiden Hutchinson was obviously better than Trayvon Walker, so they made a huge mistake there. I mean, maybe. That you probably. At the same point in time, I mean, if Hutchinson, I'm not sure this guy's going to end up being like a multi-time all-pro sort of all-world talent either. So they were going for upside there. Again, I'm not going to critique that much because we really, number one, it doesn't even measure out as being that high. And a big reason for that is there's a lot of uncertainty in that sort of thing. Number two is positional value. We have a better grip of that. We have a better understanding. We could be more confident of that. But again, the numbers are higher than choosing between players at a position, but are not that high. The thing that makes the biggest difference, and we have the most solid, fundamental, confident understanding of, is trade value. Now, sometimes you can trade up to get a quarterback and that helps you, or if you trade back and then you don't get a premium position that you would have got, maybe that could hurt you, things like that. But normally there are plenty of premium positions available at every particular time and plenty of players you could potentially choose from in those ranges. So this trade value makes a big difference. And I think that's the component where people aren't going to really understand why my numbers aren't coming up as similar to theirs. Why do I have the Colts rated so high? Well, they have consistently generate trade value. The Eagles generate a lot of trade value. Somehow they're kind of seen for that, and they're kind of known for that. But they're probably better known for the fact that they're getting consensus big board steals. But again, even this last draft, I have them earning 22 million in trade value surplus, and only 2.4 million in value for not reaching or getting steals. The Cardinals, another team that I elevated there, 11.2 million in trade value. The Dallas Cowboys, which Ben Baldwin had as tied for fifth best, and I like them. I wanted to make a comment on them because I thought that maybe they'd turn a corner. 13.4 million in trade value they got this year. And then on the flip side, when you look at the teams that are not good, teams that people are going to get on our case about, Detroit minus 22 million this year in trade value. San Francisco lost 5.5 million this year, even though they don't even have a lot of picks a lot of the time, and they're losing value. Kansas City loses 6.6 million. So there's some guys who are bleeding there. Houston gained a little bit this year, but last year lost a massive amount in trade value after the fact. They kind of had this thing where they moved up to go get Will Anderson, and that was a massive trade value loss. So again, it's not always correct, but it's the best thing that we can measure, and it's easy to implement. Ideally, in an ideal world, it's easy to implement, but an ideal world doesn't exist, and a lot of teams can't implement this even if they know this. So I'm going to give teams credit for that. And I think that's probably part of what gets lost in some of these discussions, part of what's going into my numbers that are feeding in. And I didn't go strictly by the numbers, because strictly by the numbers as I was doing it, Chicago number 1, Jacksonville number 2, Indianapolis number 3, Philly number 4, Tennessee number 5. So I did make some adjustments there. Like I gave Baltimore a ton more credit, even though their last couple drafts haven't been that great, just with historically how they've been doing there. But the rest of them, I did try to stick to teams that actually look like they've been really good over the last couple of years in their draft value. And on the flip side, I tried to have bad teams look like teams that have been actually bad by their draft value for the last couple of years. And that's where it comes together. That's where I think the difference is when it comes to some of the reaction, maybe some things we couldn't explain enough, is really looking into that trade value. Because I think we understand the other stuff a little bit better. Okay, let's go back to the questions here. And question number 1 from Samuel, although that was kind of a question that I just answered, I think. But question number 1, if there was one thing you think teams could do better across most front offices, what would it be? My thought is positional value still feels underutilized when it's nothing personal. It's just how the competitive structure is set up between negotiations and the CBA. Yeah, it's nothing personal, although there are some people who think that we fundamentally have little voodoo dolls of running backs that and I guess safeties now too, that we're putting push pins into whenever they're drafted to release our tension from the pain that we're suffering to see these positional value losses. Yeah, I think that would be the number one. That I agree, the positional value is probably the number one thing. Trading back can be a thing, cannot be a thing. Some of it is circumstance. Some of it, like, do you have a pick someone's willing to trade for? People should probably be making more trades, even if they're not getting a traditional value back on these trades. But you can only do so much there. Positional value is something that can really bleed into a bunch of different areas. And it goes back to an article that I wrote, and maybe I'll bring this up if someone has not seen it. Where I called it Inverting the Pyramid. I think I mentioned this before. So Inverting the Pyramid, and it is looking at a holistic way of looking at team building over the course of the offseason. And this goes down to a lot of questions. Say, well, what would you do if you needed X position? Let's say you need safeties, you need running backs, you need off-ball linebackers. Is a little bit, not quite as poor of a positional value position as the two others, but somewhat. Like, what are you going to do in the draft? Pass on all those positions and then have an incomplete team? No, you have to be thinking about team building in advance. So the draft is your greatest opportunity cost. Your draft picks are the greatest opportunity cost because they can hit on such huge outcomes. But they also have the highest variance because they're players who are coming from college who you don't know a lot about. So you want to have many shots. You want to have as many shots as you can in that sort of area. And the size of the theoretical player pool is the smallest in the draft. It's theoretically at least as bigger in trading and bigger in free agency, where you can go to these places. So you have to think about it, but it's inverted because free agency and trades come first. You're doing most of your work in that area first. You can still make trades after the draft, so it can be later, but a lot of the big trades happen first, and then the draft comes last. So you have to be thinking in free agency, okay, before I do anything in free agency, before I come up with my plan on how I'm going to improve my roster, as all 32 teams improve their roster, not on a relative basis, but they all on an absolute basis, improve their roster season over season. And you have to say, okay, how are we going to use these draft picks? Like, what positions do we want to use these draft picks on? And even more importantly, what positions do we not want to use those draft picks on? Like, I would rather use a draft pick on a premium position that I already theoretically have covered on the depth chart, because you always need more depth of a lot of these positions. I would rather do that than leave myself a hole in the roster where I'm using it to fill a starter that I don't have. So in free agency, you should go out there, not in a reckless manner, not just spraying cash all over the place, but in free agency, you should say, okay, I'm going to overpay a little bit. And I think this is another thing where the Jaguars, people get on the Jaguars for the fact that they spent a lot on off-ball linebackers in free agency. They probably overspent, but I actually think free agency overspending is if you're doing it for the right positions is not that big of is like not that big of a deal. And when I say you're doing for the right positions, it actually means the lower value positions, which is a weird way of saying overspending on lower value positions is good. That sounds counterintuitive, but we're talking about free agency, and you're leaving free those draft picks. So get your safeties in free agency. Get depth at those positions too, if you can, in free agency. Get your running backs in free agency. Not the greatest. You're probably going to want maybe a day 3 pick, some UDFAs, some others to mix into there. But there's some running backs who will give you a reliable, like, baseline. Everything doesn't go to hell. Not Saquon Barkley, not Josh Jacobs, not one of those guys, but Devin Singletary or something. Well, why not? So get your running backs out there. Maybe get your off-ball linebackers out there. But when we start to come into off-ball linebacker, when we start to come into wide receiver, into some degree, cornerback, we're talking about free agency there, and we're also talking about trades. Those are positions where you can get elite players in the prime of their career via trade. That cannot be said for quarterbacks, offensive tackles, and edge rushers for the most part. Just doesn't really happen. So again, you have those, and let's see if we can fill some of these spots. We have a cap, right? Let's see if we can fill some of these spots, potentially with trades. Let's do some pick swaps. Let's pick up some contracts that people are willing to get rid of, and maybe they already have a bunch of sunk cost on them that we can get a little bit cheaper for a veteran player. Let's rotate players in these positions a little bit more. And let's just build up a robust layering of players from these non-premium positions. And then in the draft, guess what? We're going to use our first round pick on a premium position. We're going to use our second round pick on a premium position. We're going to use our third round pick on a premium position. We're just going to hit that over and over and over again because you're getting the greatest cost savings and you're getting more chances to potentially hit on one of them that will make the most sense for an extension, a value-adding extension, which you don't find on a lot of these other positions. I think trades can also be really good for off-ball linebackers, and maybe we saw this to a degree with Roquan Smith, although it wasn't the least costly position to trade for. It's just they're asked to do, and this comes to tight ends also, but tight ends aren't really available at a high level via trade. But they're asked to do stuff that's so different in college versus what they're asked to do in the NFL that, getting a peek on who they are in the NFL can be pretty helpful. And that really gives you a much better understanding and more solid understanding of their value. So then if you're willing to trade for them at that point, where you would have been willing to use the draft capital on them when they were just had college performance, hey, that could be worth doing it. Whereas coming out of college, you have a better read on whether an offensive tackle can block in those one-on-one matchups, whether an edge rusher can win, whether an interior defensive lineman can generate pressure. So anyway, so that would be the one thing, being much, much more rigid about positional value. Not to the point of, like I quoted something on Twitter about, like, the ideal is not like a real thing. Ideality and reality never meet. So we don't want to hold ourselves to so high of a standard that we can't function in reality, but as well as you can. Try to stick to that. So yeah, so I think I agree with Samuel there that that's the one thing that I would point to. All right. And then question 2 from Samuel here. How do you explain taking certain analytics to their extremes and seeing how they hold up? You can pick and choose which models to use, but also know their limitations in application. As much as I believe in positional value, if your model says never to draft a running back ever, it seems a bit extreme to build that position only from minimum free agents in UDFA. Well, number one, I would say you don't have to do minimum free agents. So there are some outs there. But no, I agree. This goes back to the ideal versus reality. There are going to be some issues. And this is something we're going to see. Maybe I'll talk about Eric Eager a little bit here too. Because those of you who don't know, Eric Eager, formerly of Sumer Sports, before that PFF, who I worked with, who I'm quite friendly with, he is now moving on to work for David Tepper. Hopefully he's not wearing a hat around the office when he shouldn't be. He's going to go and work for David Tepper in Carolina. And I think we've seen with Kwesi, who was an analytics guy, didn't have a lot of public opinions out there, but was an analytics guy on the inside who is now making some moves that has analytics guys like myself scratching our heads. There are impediments to what you can do. There are other people who are trying to make decisions. There are ideas of whether you need buy-in or not. There's ownership, which has a huge role in what's going on there. So yeah, in application, it can become much, much more difficult. If you have to throw someone a bone and say, hey, you want a round 4 running back that you want? Fine. We'll hopefully we'll get an extra pick through trading down. We'll get an extra 4th round pick thrown in there, and you can use that on a running back if you want. I would still say you shouldn't do it in theory and probably in practice, but we're not living on an island here. And I think though, when it comes to models, and this is something that when it comes to 4th down models, the quote that Josh Hermsmeyer at Frisco Josh likes to use a lot about having strong opinions weakly held, that comes into play for these things. So strong opinions weakly held means you have to make a decision. So you have to make a decision. This comes to like 4th down decisions also. What player you're going to pick for positional value, this and that. You can recognize uncertainty, but still say, this is the best information we have. We have to make a decision. We can't say, oh, this is an uncertain decision, so we're going to make 60% of one decision and 40% of another decision. You have to make 100% of one decision. That's your only choice. So you say, I have all this information. I'm just going to make us have a strong opinion about making what I believe to be the best decision at this point in time. Now, if you have a bunch of multiple picks, maybe you can hedge a little bit, this and that, but I don't know. I probably wouldn't even do that. And then you say to yourself, if I get new information, it's a weakly held opinion. So if I get new information, I'm not locked in. I'm not worried about the sunk costs. I'm not worried about reputational damage from changing my opinion. I'm ready to change my opinion. I change my opinion all the time, especially when the numbers dictate me from going a different direction. I mean, I'm going to talk about later when quarterback perception, how I'm higher on Joe Burrow maybe than some others are after being pretty low on him for a number of years. I don't have anything against Joe Burrow. I'm not a positive Joe Burrow all the time person or negative Joe Burrow all the time person. You change your opinion. In fact, I was even talking about this with my wife, who has like managerial responsibilities that she has to deal with, and she has trouble sometimes with people questioning decisions and how to think about it. And I tried to give her, and I think she got some benefit out of the idea of, listen, it is uncertain, but you have to make a decision. So you make a strong decision. Then you reflect upon it, and you have real information that you're taking back and feedback and what could you have known and things like that. But you don't continually say, I shouldn't have had a strong opinion, or I should be wishy-washy about this, or I should allow everyone to chime in and allow everyone to have a vote on what's going on. That's not making an evidence-based decision. You have to just use what you have and move forward. And then you can look back afterwards. So anyway, that's my 2 cents there on how you deal with the ideal versus the extremes. Is you try to compromise, you make strong decisions, but you're willing to change your opinion all the time too. Okay, and then the last question here from Samuel is your disdain for the Browns front office, maybe we'll talk about that because I don't think I have disdain, more related to Watson trade? Is it that they potentially is that potentially the worst trade in NFL history, even discounting value for quarterback? It seems like they took a huge amount of unnecessary risk and didn't account enough for an unlikely but disastrous outcome or tail risk. Had some very good, maybe even elite season and didn't play an entire year. Yeah, the Watson thing is really interesting from a pure football perspective. I made my opinion pretty well known from from an outside, like, who is this dude opinion, that I wouldn't want anywhere near my team. But from a pure football opinion, it was a unique situation. So I don't have disdain for the Browns front office. I think I had them ranked 4th last year. And then I moved them down a little bit because I wanted to recognize some others because I don't think they've done anything that's been that great front office wise in terms of, again, trade value. Where's the trade value? Why Barry's making like no trades to get extra picks and things like that. Positional value has been okay. There's just nothing that really was wowing me about what they were doing. So I don't have disdain for them. I just don't have them in the top 5 anymore. Is it potentially the worst trade in NFL history? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly, again, if we're going to be a process-based thing, I don't think you could say it from a process standpoint that it was the worst trade in NFL history because Watson was an elite quarterback. I mean, he was on a Hall of Fame adjacent sort of trajectory. I know it's very early in his career, but he was playing that well up until that point. Now, did they not account for enough of this tail risk? That's an interesting question. Because when you don't have anything like this before, it's really difficult to gauge. The only thing you could look at is say, there are some quarterbacks who got injured and missed an entire season. And then I think for the most part, if they were a well-established quarterback who was actually good, they did come back and perform. It's not the same thing, but maybe like Tom Brady tearing his ACL week 1 or Peyton Manning missing an entire season because of his neck and the neck surgery and all that sort of stuff. I mean, they came back and they were, MVP level type of players again. So is there something unique about this situation? Is there some sort of psychological issue with, I don't know, guilt and having to deal with the media and cognitive dissonance of whatever's going on in his head about being a good person versus these, heinous crimes which probably took place? I don't know. That's really difficult to get your head around. But I think generally the tail risk, while there, and you have to acknowledge there was tail risk there, I think this was an outcome that wouldn't be your most likely outcome, is that he would be, again, on this Hall of Fame sort of trajectory and then come out and just not be good so far. But I'll talk a little bit about quarterbacks later that he still doesn't project that poorly if you ignore these kind of tail risk sort of things. All right, let's move to the next question here. My question is about a particular subset of quarterbacks, either up for extension or the foundation for a large team building bet. Stroud, Love, and Goff. Taking into account your adjusted quarterback ratings and Bayesian rankings, how do you see the uncertainty of a 3-year projection from them and whom you'd have the most confidence of high-level play? And B, what would the optimal front office approaches look like for each of these teams going forward with that in mind? He also put something here about Burrow and his injury and whether anyone's had to recover from this sort of injury before. An interesting quote here on Burrow where it says, Burrow's encouraged but acknowledged this hasn't been an easy path to this point. The biggest challenge, he said, was the uncertainty and admitting they were kind of flying blind, in quotes, since no major quarterbacks have been through this type of injury before. He found himself consulting with linebackers and defensive linemen. That's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about that. So what I did was I went and ran numbers for the Bayesian quarterback rankings. So I'm gonna share that for those of you on YouTube here for the numbers that I came up with. So what I do for this is I look back at every snap. You take the EPA on the snap. You take the projected average that you would expect from a quarterback there. You have an assumption going into each play, which is built off of their prior evidence or their draft position going all the way back to when they came into the NFL. And it adjusts. It adjusts based upon your assumption for the range, the true kind of range of outcomes, the true standard deviation of range of outcomes for a career number. And it also adjusts based upon, on a play-by-play difference, how much variance there is in play-by-play performance. So this is not going to account for quality of defenses faced, which kind of blends out over a long enough timeline. It's not going to account for help that you have on offense or anything like that. It's just going to be pure numbers. And then I roll that into a median projection, which is the mean projection here, because we're projecting a normal distribution of range of outcomes for each quarterback. And that range of outcomes is going to become more narrow. In other words, lower ceiling, higher floor. The more snaps you have, the more confident you are, the more dropbacks you have, the more plays you've been a part of. It also includes rushing as part of this too. So that's going to happen. So it's going to have a median projected for the number of standard deviations over average. And then it's going to have it's also going to have a number for like how far above you could potentially be and how far down you could potentially be for your ceiling. So I have numbers here for their ranks for all the different quarterbacks, the exact standard deviation projection, just so you can kind of get like a tiering idea there about quarterbacks and say, okay, someone may be ranked 4, like for instance, 4 and 7 are barely separated at all. And then there's a huge gap between 3 and 4 in these numbers and a pretty big gap between 7 and 8. So it's knowing those sorts of things is helpful. And then I also have a ceiling rank, which is saying based upon that distribution of outcomes we have for every single player, the ceilings are going to be higher for players who have less history because we don't know as much about them. So I'll talk about it in the context of CJ Stroud. So I'll talk about all these guys, the quarterbacks mentioned in this question, which again, specifically were Stroud, Love, and Goff. So I'll talk about them, but then also all the quarterbacks here. So Patrick Mahomes is number 1, according to these rankings. 3.3 standard deviations above average is his normal, best guess projection. So like the difference between him and Aaron Rodgers is the difference between Aaron Rodgers and an average quarterback. Aaron Rodgers is second on this list. And again, it doesn't take account for age effects. So, take that for what it's worth. I mean, Aaron Rodgers was the MVP a couple of seasons in a row, right? Recently, when he wasn't injured. But the gap is just huge. Mahomes is just all by himself, and he has the highest ceiling rank too. There's no one who's getting close. Rodgers' ceiling is more 6th overall because other guys jump him because Rodgers has this huge history of performance. So it's unlikely that he's going to, step up to an even higher level now that he's, almost 40 years old that we hadn't anticipated. So Josh Allen is 3rd on this. He has the 2nd highest in his ceiling ranking. So he jumps Rodgers for what could potentially happen in the future. And he has a huge gap down. So the way that the NFL really aligns right now, according to these Bayesian numbers, and I think in my mind also, is like Patrick Mahomes, number 1. Aaron Rodgers could be really, really, really good if he hasn't declined, age-wise hasn't declined, and injury-wise hasn't declined. I mean, it's hard to argue against that, right? Like if he doesn't have any age-related decline, the guy's got more MVPs than anyone else in NFL history other than Peyton Manning. And then 3rd after that is Josh Allen, who, if you exclude Rodgers, because we're looking at, guys who aren't 4 years old, he's kind of like the clear number 2 quarterback. And you could still call him, if you wanted to, the number 2 quarterback and say Rodgers, we'll give him this age-related decline. We'll give him the uncertainty from the Achilles and we'll move him down. I'd be fine with that. And I probably would actually do that. Okay, so the next grouping, though, we have Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, and Justin Herbert, 4 through 7. Now, these guys are smashed together. It's 0.66 standard deviations for Dak Prescott and 0.63 for Justin Herbert. So basically nothing separating these guys. So you could arrange these any way you want. Now, I would probably arrange them Herbert, Burrow, Prescott, Tagovailoa, but whatever way you want to do it is however you want to do it. Those are their median outcomes. Those are the guys there. Now, amongst these guys, Prescott has the most career history coming into the league in 2016 versus these others who came into the league at 2020. So his upside may be a little bit capped versus these others, but his downside is probably lower than these others. And if you want to say, oh, let's do an adjustment for Tua because he has great help, so we shouldn't really be in this tier, I'm fine with all of that sort of stuff. But that's how it plays out. But again, none of these guys really similar to getting up to Josh Allen. So Burrow here, like I said, I'd probably have him as 5th. And there was a little bit of a brouhaha about the Athletic Pod and what they were doing because they drafted him 8th in their exercise. So they drafted him not only after Herbert, but then also after Dak Prescott, also after CJ Stroud, also after, I don't know who else they do, Lamar Jackson. So at least those guys, maybe more guys too. So Trevor Lawrence, after Trevor Lawrence, I'll get to him. So they had him after all those different guys. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there going on with Burrow. I know that the injury stuff is maybe unique sort of thing. At the same time, if you look at MVP odds, he's not that far off of Allen and Mahomes. And, the year before he was almost equivalent to Mahomes or a little bit off of Mahomes. So he's still seen as being right up there versus some others. And I think there maybe is a disconnect with at least some people in their perceptions on Burrow versus how good he can actually be. And according to my bloodless, cold hard facts numbers, he comes in 5th here with a lot more upside than someone like Dak Prescott, who's 4th. Okay, then next I have Brock Purdy with a little bit of a step down, right next to CJ Stroud. And these guys are 3rd and 4th when it comes to their ceilings because they don't have that many pass attempts. Now, CJ Stroud is someone, and again, that's part of what we're talking about. He's one of the quarterbacks listed here, where I think he went 5th overall after only Mahomes, Allen, Lamar Jackson, and then CJ Stroud in this athletic football pod draft. He's someone who smells a little bit, I don't want to say overvalued, but we're a little bit overconfident in him. Great rookie season, which gives him a much stronger chance of being a great quarterback than if he was a bad rookie. But we don't really figure things out until after this season. He has one of the highest ceilings, but also his floor outcome is pretty low compared to other guys who were in the mid-tier of quarterbacks. So if you want to knock Brock Purdy a bunch and Tua a bunch for their surrounding cast and elevate Stroud based upon that, that would put him at 7th. And I think I'd be fine at 7th. So I'm not that far out from what other people are saying, but I'm not putting him, above a bunch of other guys who you could put in here. I'm not putting him above like the Burrows and Herberts and others of the world. I know he has the contract thing, but I actually don't think contract should be considered that much. The first time the Athletics show did an exercise on this, I think they messed up accounting for contracts way too much. It was after Herbert's second year, and they had Herbert number 1 over Patrick Mahomes because of the contract. And obviously that was a mistake. So it still has Deshaun Watson at number 10. Again, we have this like very unique situation of him switching teams. It is a tier down to get from Stroud at 9 to Deshaun Watson at 10. So I'm fine knocking him quite a bit further down than that. Now we get in some other names. These are the names that we're being asked about here in the question. So Goff is at 13th below Stafford and Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson is probably looking pretty low. Now it's really Stafford, Lamar Jackson, then a pretty big teardrop down to Goff at 13th, where I think that kind of separates guys who you're hoping for can have elite outcomes above Jared Goff, and then guys who are going to be more like above average quarterback sort of good outcomes, which is below Lamar Jackson. So after this 12th spot is a cutoff. Now Lamar's low, but if you look at his MVP odds, I think he's something like 6th or 7th or 8th in MVP odds. He's not that high in MVP odds, despite winning last year. I mean, we've gone over this a bunch of times, but he wasn't that great by the numbers. So then replicating that sort of defensive, special teams, and everything else record to get the record for the team, and then everything coming together and being another outlier type of season as far as winning MVP with poor efficiency, which we've only seen from Jackson and really Cam Newton before. Probably not going to happen again. So Goff is like at the top of the next tier of guys who you're like solid quarterbacks, probably not like elite or special in any sort of way. But Jordan Love is also in that tier just because he has less history. If he had more history, how he performed last year, he would be much higher. He's 10th as far as his ceiling outcome, where Jared Goff is 19th. So much higher. So that's an interesting thing to look at. And when you look at like Goff versus Love, it's really like, I think the median outcome for Goff is probably higher than it is for Love because he has so much uncertainty. But of course, you probably still want to take a shot on Love instead, because you could get that elite outcome that would last a number of years going forward. Trevor Lawrence, a little bit below Love here. I don't know what to think about Trevor. Like, I think he was better according to the adjusted quarterback numbers, where you make a bunch of adjustments for drops and other things like that. So maybe he didn't get enough credit for that. And because of that, this lowers these numbers, which go into the calculation. So it's 16th below all these other guys, because Russell Wilson falls in here too. And I think we can safely drop him. He's getting a lot of help from early in his career. His ceiling outcome is also pretty low. So, I don't know about Lawrence. Is he 16th? No. I think you can drop a number of guys down here. Is he top 10? I don't know. Like, it's pretty close to me, and, shows like The Athletic Pod are putting him in the top 5 or 6 or something like that, and I don't know. Putting him above Joe Burrow? No, I can't do that. I can't do that personally. The next guy is pretty interesting is Jalen Hurts after all that, and, somewhat it's a function of the fact that there are just so many names in here, and we have guys like Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson still sneaking in there, and Deshaun Watson still sneaking in there, who probably should fall out. But this also lends to my point of maybe not being as high on the Philadelphia Eagles front offices. You're really tied to this guy. Huge contract for Jalen Hurts, huge contract for AJ Brown, huge contract for Devontae Smith, pretty big contract tight end wise for Dallas Goedert, a lot of big contracts on the offensive line. And this is the type of performance that we're projecting out for Jalen Hurts on a median basis. And his ceiling doesn't look great according to these numbers. And a decent amount of it has been based upon pushing to get that number. I don't know. It's a little like, I'd be a little bit worried that things could go off the rails for the Eagles, with a lot of commitments to a lot of different players if Jalen Hurts doesn't work out. I mean, I love Jalen Hurts. Obviously, I built my brand somewhat on saying that was a great pick, but I didn't love the extension there. So that's kind of how my ideas play out for quarterback this year. And I'd be interested to see specifically Joe Burrow, how the perception will change there. Lamar Jackson, how his season starts. Jordan Love could go either direction. And CJ Stroud is a big one. CJ Stroud, if he struggles a bit at the beginning of the season, it'll be interesting to see a lot of people who are putting him, and again, he was 5th overall in this Athletic Pod drafting. A lot of people are saying, I'd rather have him than have Herbert or Burrow. And that almost seems to be the default take at this point. I wouldn't yet at this point. Even accounting for contract, I wouldn't at this point, but I will reflect. I will update. It's a strong opinion, weekly held. I will update as the season goes on. Okay. And the Burrow thing with the injury, it is interesting that this is like a unique injury, but I would say I don't know too many quarterbacks who have had their careers derailed via injury that it wasn't like a running type of quarterback. And even if it was, if you're going to say RG3 had his career derailed by injury, I mean, he probably just wasn't good. He probably got lucky as a rookie with a bunch of running and deep in an NFL that hadn't caught up to it yet. And then, things fell apart in a similar way to how things got a lot more difficult for Colin Kaepernick and others who didn't have to deal with injuries in the same way. All right, next question here. Can you expand more on why the Giants are in your bottom 5 front office, which I agree with? I don't understand their current plan. The way they approached the draft, it looked like they're still trying to win now with Daniel Jones, but the day after the draft, Joe Sheen is preaching patience with a mediocre QB on a $47 million cap hit makes no sense. I mean, you kind of wrapped it all up here. I think how I typified it in a very non-analytical sort of way was lack of hope. Like, where's the hope here? What's your hope? There's no quarterback. You got Daniel Jones, who you could get rid of after this season, if you don't restructure. What are they going to do? Are they going to restructure him, eventually after the season? If they have a decent year this year, I don't know. I just don't know where your upside is. You trade away draft capital for Brian Burns, and it's like, okay, yeah, there is a lot of win now-edness going on here in this draft, and they probably got to save their jobs at this point. You can't have a bad year. You can't not make the playoffs and still have a job if you're Daboll and Joe Shane. Did I say this right? Or shall I say it correctly? You probably can't have a job for those guys. So yeah, I think that is what they're doing. And this is another thing, like one of the bigger complaints about the front office rankings was the fact that Ben had the 49ers in his bottom 5. And one reason that I took them out of my bottom 5, and when I thought about it, and maybe it's not because they've been so successful. Again, we got to be able to separate, right, the success from the decisions. It's that quarterback, even though you could say they got lucky on Mr. Irrelevant, and that's where they are right now. They've been one of the more aggressive teams when it comes to quarterbacks ever since Shanahan and Lynch got there. For a team and an offensive system and everything else that people think doesn't need to spend a quarterback, you can throw anyone in there and they'll be a great quarterback. They made the trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. Maybe other teams would have done the same. But still, they're winless, 0-10, middle of the season, made the trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. He came in there, won 6 straight games, or was it 5 straight games? Whatever they did at the end of the season, re-signed him that offseason for what I believe was either the biggest or a top 3 quarterback contract in the NFL. So taking a swing there. Front loading it so they could get out of it later. It probably looks like pauper money compared to what these guys are making nowadays, but still, they did that. Then they traded up all these picks to go get Trey Lance. Was Trey Lance a great prospect that they should have done that for? I don't know, but they're taking swings at least. So I like that. I like teams that are being adventurous and taking swings at quarterback. Giants, not one of those teams. Okay, let's see what other questions I have. Maybe I'll go to Twitter first to see if anyone said anything there, and then I'll get to the Q&A in the okay, so Twitter here. Okay, Trevor Lawrence. Is it Trevor Lawrence? Trevor Lawrence has mixed options. His overall production has been about average. This is from Sam Birch, by the way. 67th percentile starter, yet he's viewed by some as a top 5 quarterback. I know your adjusted EPA numbers have him being great last year. So what quality of player is he to you? I think I answered most of that. Yeah, I think he's still got the potential to be a top quarterback, but I don't know about, like, I'm just not putting him in the category of the Burrow, the Herbert, obviously the Mahomes and the Allen. Maybe he can get there versus some of these other guys. But if like Kyler Murray ends up being a better quarterback, I wouldn't be that surprised than Trevor Lawrence. So I don't know. I do think the adjusted numbers give him a little bit of a boost, but there's still enough to worry about there where I'm not quite sure. All right, let's go to the questions in the chat. If anyone has questions in the chat here before we wrap her up. Okay. How do you feel about close relationships with people like Eric now that they have a position in the NFL? Does that change your interest level as a fan? Does it give you validation or pride, etc.? Not much on the validation or pride aspect, I wouldn't say. I mean, I do know quite a few people in the NFL in different areas. It's always interesting to see like how much or how little influence they have on what's going on, mostly the latter. And I probably do give a little bit too much credit to certain teams, maybe even the Jaguars, because I know some people at the Jaguars, for what they're doing. When I see them making a smart move, I might attribute it more to the people that they have and the fact that I like the people that they have, versus it could have just been a random good move amongst bad moves, which are generally coming. So it will just be most interesting for me seeing Eric with a very strong-minded owner, at least from what we've seen so far, with a front office, which for Scott Fitterer, I mean, he's been there a little while now. I don't know if things don't go well this year. Where is he going to be? He could be gone. Even if who's it? Canales who's the head coach there. Even if he sticks around, he could be gone. So hopefully Eric is part of a structure, maybe similar to what we saw with Paul DePodesta with the Browns, where DePodesta reports directly to the owner outside of the other structure, outside of the GM structure. And I think that would be the way to go, to have like, because a lot of these things that you're doing for analytics, they have a compounding effect. Like the investment that you're making on tracking data today and then over the next year is going to have very little effect versus 5 years from now, once you've been doing all that stuff. The difference that it's going to make between year 4 and year 5 and year 6 are going to be huge, the compounding effect there. So you need time for these sorts of positions. And I just hope that he has that more than anything else, is that you can live through multiple front office or coaching regimes and still being there and doing that work in the background. The problem is, then that might mean that you're not getting enough say on the decisions that are being made, because if you're getting a lot of say on the decisions that are being made and the decisions don't go well, then you're like the GM and you're fired and you're out of there probably. It's kind of, there's a weird difference there where I'm just never sure whether analytics people can really make that big of a difference unless they are the GM. And even if they are the GM, if they don't have ownership in the right area, can they really make that big of a difference? I don't know. It'll be an interesting experiment. Um, Eric will definitely be able to prove his football loving chops, his bona fides in that degree, because the guy knows everything about every player who's ever played football. So he knows all that stuff. Played tight end in college also. So hopefully that'll help him along the way. Okay. What is the most football guy opinion that you have? That's a good question. What is the most football guy opinion that I have? I have to think about that one for a while. Now I'm going to reveal myself for being an ideologue by not having a good football guy opinion. Well, I don't know if it's the most football. This is not really a football guy opinion, but my favorite position to watch growing up, and I got him on the wall here. See if I can do this correctly. Barry Sanders, and then I got Marcus Allen over here, also on the wall. I love me some running backs. Love me some running backs growing up. So that was pretty football guy-y, was thinking about that. And maybe I'm wrong, but I still think, Barry Sanders is an actual difference maker. Is he worth the number 3 pick overall, which I think he was back in the day? Maybe not. But legit difference maker there. So maybe that's a bit football guy-y of me, as I do think that the running backs can make a big difference. It's just not stable. It's just really figuring out who's that stable performer. Because the numbers that I have for plus minus are like pretty big for guys like Christian McCaffrey and others. It's just, can we rely on it going forward? And maybe for someone like McCaffrey, we can rely on it more going forward. But just to give an example, it was Jonathan Taylor before who had the big numbers, and now it's kind of disappeared. Any insights, another question here, any insight into how much the team's GMs, scouting departments weigh the mental attitude and physical measurements in combine pro day process? Well, the physical measurements, it does seem to make a difference. If you look at the information I have on like what makes a difference in the combine, what matters, there's a lot of correlation, especially when it comes to speed and other things. So I do think that helps move guys up boards more than anything else. I think top prospects are more solidified, but it can sneak guys higher and higher up. There's a lot of wide receivers in particular where it makes a huge difference for guys if they run really, really fast and they move up like a Christian Watson or someone like that. But then if guys don't run at all, like maybe a Drake London in the same draft, you can still be drafted pretty high. So I think it does make a big difference there. And mental attitude stuff, I don't think that really comes into play during the combine. They have these short interviews, which seem like a waste of time, honestly. But they do different, reference checks, and they do different other sort of testing as part of their visits, top 30 visits and other information that's being collected. So that probably makes a difference. We just don't really know like why guys fall down boards or not. I wish I had more information into that, because there could be some big falls where I don't think it's just a disagreement on tape, because no one on a consensus big board will have them that low. And it normally ends up being right. So what are those things that are going on? I don't know. Meds, medicals. I mean, they said like Rashee Rice, you say he was off of some people's boards. They're talking about that for him. The Chiefs took him in the second round as kind of a reach. So I don't know. Okay. Why do you give so much credit to Baltimore? Since the GM change, it seems they have done poorly in regards to understanding positional value with things like the Smith trade. Well, the Smith trade, I have, like I said, I have a little bit of a different opinion on that, because I do think that like part of the reason a position is a bad value in the draft is part of the reason is it doesn't provide much relative value. And once you're in the NFL, it's not very stable what the performance is. That'd be like a running back or even a safety. The stability of performance is pretty low. And the second part is like they're just really, really hard to scout. So that's like a tight end is really, really hard to scout. But hell, if you can find Travis Kelce, then you'd want to take him in the top 10. Easy. Problem is Travis Kelce's going in the third round. So I think linebacker is similar to that. We just have trouble scouting these guys. You got the Devin Whites and Devin Bushes of the world. They were taken super early because they're athletic marvels, and they're really like great at stopping the run more than anything in college. We see them, and then they don't get as much opportunity to show their ability to in coverage, which is going to matter in the pros. But maybe once you've seen that for someone like Roquan Smith and you've seen that and you have that knowledge, maybe it transfers a little bit better. Oh, Fritterer is not even there anymore. Oh, you're right. Yeah. Sorry, I just saw someone else's comment on that. That guy already has been fired. Wow. Okay. So, but anyway, back to linebackers. I'm willing to adjust my opinion on that somewhat for trades, not for the draft though. Don't draft them early. Don't draft them early, please. Yeah, and I agree with the positional value stuff, but they do things to hedge that by not reaching on players. And they didn't trade back this last draft, but generally they're willing to trade back and do things like that. And I just know that they have a lot of infrastructure there, and they've been using a lot of that data and other things for a long time. So I agree. If another, I'm giving them the long tail of success, and they had no comp picks this year, so that's changed a bit. Maybe things are going to get a little bit dicey going forward, paying Lamar Jackson a lot of money, those sorts of things. Maybe I'll get off of the Ravens, but I'm still going to stick them there for now. And again, it becomes one of these problems where it's asymmetric when you're doing the rankings for these front offices. Like, it's really easier to point out the bad front offices than it is to figure out who the good ones are. And that becomes part of it. All right. I think that's it for the questions here. We've gone a little bit over an hour. I appreciate everyone tuning in. I'll try to do this exercise again next week. Maybe get an interview in. I was trying to get Eric Eager to come on sometime. I was going to ask him, and now that might be tough. Maybe I'm going to get an exclusive. Getting an exclusive with him where he just says no comment over and over again when I ask him whether he's going to trade Bryce Young for a third-round pick this upcoming season if things aren't going so well halfway through the year. We'll end up seeing. But I'll get Frisco Josh back on here. I'll get some other people back on here who are doing some good work in the analytics space. And go ahead, sign up. Unexpectedpoints.substack.com. I appreciate all the support there. We got a good little bump this week with the Ben Baldwin interview. So I'll try to do more stuff like that in the future. Until then, I'll be talking at everyone next week. Thanks so much, guys.